The fluorescent lights of Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport cast harsh shadows across the polished terminal floors as the evening rush began to wind down. Gate 47 buzzed with the usual chaos of delayed flights and weary passengers, their voices creating a symphony of frustration that echoed through the sprawling concourse. Among the crowd, a tall black man in an impeccably tailored Navy uniform walked with purpose, his silver wings gleaming under the artificial light, his captain's stripes clearly visible on his sleeves. Andre Washington moved through the terminal with the confidence of someone who belonged there, his leather flight bag slung over his shoulder and his pilot's cap tucked neatly under his arm. At 42, he commanded respect, not just through his position as chief pilot for Atlantic Airways, but through his calm demeanor and unwavering professionalism. His dark eyes swept the terminal with the practiced assessment of a man accustomed to responsibility, noting the flow of passengers, the positioning of security personnel, and the general rhythm of the airport's evening operations. He had just completed a routine briefing with his crew and was making his way to the pilot's lounge when the first sign of trouble appeared. Near the security checkpoint, he noticed a commotion brewing around a young black man who appeared to be arguing with airport security. Andre slowed his pace, his instincts telling him to observe rather than intervene immediately. He had learned over the years that sometimes the best way to help was to understand the full situation before acting. The young man, who couldn't have been more than 25, wore the uniform of an airline ground crew member, his identification badge clearly visible on his chest. His voice carried across the terminal, strained with frustration and growing desperation as he tried to explain something to the two security officers who had cornered him near the departure boards. One of the officers, a burly white man with graying hair and a permanent scowl etched into his features, kept jabbing his finger toward the young employee's badge while shaking his head dismissively. His partner, younger and seemingly less experienced, stood slightly behind him, his hand resting uncertainly on his radio as if unsure whether to call for backup. Andre couldn't hear the specific words being exchanged, but he recognized the body language, the tone, the familiar rhythm of an encounter that was escalating beyond reason. He had seen it before, experienced it himself in different contexts, and he knew how quickly situations like this could spiral out of control. The young employee, whose name tag read Keon, was gesturing frantically toward the departures board, his voice rising as he tried to explain something about his shift schedule and his legitimate reason for being in that area of the terminal. But the older security officer, whose badge identified him as Harrison, wasn't listening. His face had taken on the closed, determined expression of a man who had already made up his mind about guilt and innocence. Andre felt his jaw tighten as he watched Harrison grab Keon's arm roughly, spinning him around to face the wall. The younger officer finally stepped forward, his radio crackling to life as he called for additional support. Within moments, the situation had transformed from a simple misunderstanding into something far more serious. That's when Andre decided to act. He approached the group with measured steps, his posture non-threatening but authoritative. His years of command experience had taught him how to project calm confidence even in tense situations, and he drew on that training now as he prepared to intervene. "Excuse me, officers," Andre said, his voice carrying clearly over the ambient noise of the terminal. "Is there a problem here?" Officer Harrison turned toward him, his eyes immediately taking in Andre's appearance, scanning from his face down to his uniform with an expression that hardened almost instantly. The younger officer, whose nameplate read Brennan, looked between Andre and his partner with obvious uncertainty. "This doesn't concern you," Harrison said curtly, his grip tightening on Keon's arm. "Move along." Andre remained calm, his hands visible and relaxed at his sides. "I'm Andre Washington, chief pilot for Atlantic Airways. This young man appears to be one of our employees, which makes this very much my concern." Harrison's eyes narrowed as he studied Andre more closely, taking in the pilot's uniform, the stripes, the wings. For a moment, something flickered across his expression, perhaps doubt or surprise, but it was quickly replaced by suspicion. You got some identification? Harrison demanded, releasing Keon, but shifting his attention fully to Andre. Andre reached slowly into his jacket pocket, extracting his company identification card and his pilot's license. He handed them over calmly, noting how Harrison's partner stepped closer, his own hand moving instinctively toward his weapon. Harrison examined the credentials with exaggerated thoroughness, holding them up to the light, comparing the photo to Andre's face multiple times. The process took far longer than necessary, and Andre recognized it for what it was, a power play, an attempt to establish dominance through bureaucratic theater. "These look fake to me," Harrison announced finally, handing the documents back with a dismissive flick of his wrist. "Real pilots don't walk around bothering security officers."
Sterling's face flushed red, anger and embarrassment mixing in equal measure. "Don't get smart with me. I know troublemakers when I see them, and you're obviously here to cause problems. I'm calling security." He reached for the phone behind the counter, his movements sharp and aggressive. Dr. Foster stood perfectly still, her training kicking in. In surgery, when everything went wrong, when a patient's life hung by a thread, she had learned to remain calm, to think clearly, to act with precision. This situation required the same approach. "You're making a mistake," she said simply, but Sterling was already dialing. "Security to the gift shop immediately," he barked into the phone. "I have a situation here with someone impersonating medical staff and causing a disturbance." The other customers were now openly staring, some pulling out their phones to record the scene. Dr. Foster felt exposed, vulnerable in a way that her years of education and professional success had never quite been able to shield her from. She was no longer Dr. Melanie Foster, respected cardiac surgeon. In Sterling's eyes, and potentially in the eyes of everyone watching, she had been reduced to a stereotype, a threat, someone who didn't belong. Within minutes, Isaiah Thompson, one of the hospital's security guards, appeared at the entrance to the gift shop. Thompson was a large, imposing man in his 40s, and Dr. Foster recognized him from the hallways. He had always nodded respectfully when they passed, the kind of professional courtesy that existed between hospital staff. But now, seeing her as the subject of a security call, confusion flickered across his face. "What's the problem here?" Thompson asked, his voice carefully neutral as he looked between Sterling and Dr. Foster. "This woman is impersonating a doctor," Sterling said quickly, his tone triumphant. "She's trying to scam the hospital, and when I called her out on it, she became belligerent and threatening." Thompson's eyes shifted to Dr. Foster, and she could see the conflict there. He recognized her, she was certain of it, but the situation was complicated by Sterling's accusations and the growing crowd of onlookers. "Ma'am," Thompson said carefully, "I'm going to need to see some identification." Dr. Foster reached slowly for her badge, her movements deliberate and non-threatening. Years of being one of the few black faces in predominantly white medical institutions had taught her to be hyper-aware of how her actions might be perceived. She handed Thompson her hospital ID, her medical license, and her state identification. Thompson examined the documents carefully, his expression growing more troubled with each passing second. He looked up at Dr. Foster, then at Sterling, then back at the IDs in his hands. "Sir," he said to Sterling, his voice tight with barely controlled frustration, "this is Dr. Melanie Foster. She's the head of cardiac surgery here." Sterling snatched the IDs from Thompson's hands, examining them with the intensity of a detective searching for evidence. "These have to be fake," he muttered. "There's no way." "There's no way what?" Dr. Foster interrupted, her composure finally beginning to crack. "There's no way a black woman could be a doctor? There's no way someone who looks like me could have earned the right to work in this hospital?" The gift shop had grown uncomfortably quiet, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. Sterling's face grew redder as he continued to examine the credentials, clearly searching for some way to maintain his position. "I don't care what these papers say," he finally declared, throwing the IDs back at Dr. Foster with enough force that they scattered across the floor. "I know what I see, and I see someone who doesn't belong here. I want her removed from my shop immediately." Thompson bent down to help Dr. Foster collect her scattered identification, his movements stiff with embarrassment and anger. As he handed her the IDs, he whispered, "Dr. Foster, I'm sorry about this. We both know who you are, but the damage was done." The scene had been witnessed by dozens of people, some of whom had undoubtedly recorded it on their phones. Word would spread quickly through the hospital, through social media, through the community. Dr. Melanie Foster, a woman who had spent her entire career proving herself worthy of respect, had been publicly humiliated and accused of fraud by a gift shop manager who couldn't see past the color of her skin. "I want to speak to Mr. Crawford," she said quietly, referring to David Crawford, the hospital's board chairman. "I want him to know exactly what kind of people he has representing this institution." Sterling laughed, a sound devoid of any warmth or humor. "Good luck with that. Mr. Crawford doesn't have time for troublemakers and scam artists. Security, escort her out of here." Thompson looked mortified. "Sir, with all due respect, Dr. Foster is—" "I don't care what she claims to be," Sterling snapped. "I want her gone." Dr. Foster straightened her white coat and looked directly at Sterling, her voice calm but filled with quiet determination. "You've made a serious error in judgment today, but don't worry. This won't be forgotten or swept under the rug. The truth has a way of coming to light." As she turned to leave, she could hear Sterling muttering to the remaining customers, trying to justify his actions, trying to paint himself as the victim of some elaborate deception. But Dr. Foster was no longer listening. Her mind was already working, planning, strategizing. She had faced discrimination before, but never so blatantly, never so publicly. This time, there would be consequences. The walk from the gift shop to the elevator felt like the longest journey of Dr. Melanie Foster's life. Every step echoed in the marble lobby of Mercy General Hospital, each sound seeming to announce her humiliation to everyone within earshot. Hospital staff, patients, and visitors went about their business, unaware that one of their most accomplished physicians had just been accused of impersonation and fraud by a gift shop manager who couldn't see past the color of her skin. As the elevator doors closed behind her, Dr. Foster finally allowed herself a moment to process what had just occurred. Her hands, steady and sure when holding a scalpel or suturing a heart, trembled slightly as she pressed the button for the 5th floor. The reflection in the polished steel doors showed a woman who looked tired, hurt, and angry, but still maintaining the dignity that had carried her through years of similar, if less public, humiliations. The cardiac surgery department was bustling with its usual controlled chaos when she arrived. Nurses moved efficiently between patient rooms, residents huddled over charts discussing treatment plans, and the constant beeping of monitors created the symphony of a place where life and death decisions were made every hour of every day. This was her domain, the place where her expertise was never questioned, where her judgment could mean the difference between a patient going home to their family or never waking up again. Aaliyah Washington, one of the senior nurses in the department, looked up as Dr. Foster approached the nurses' station. Aaliyah had worked with Dr. Foster for 3 years, and the two women had developed a mutual respect born from countless emergencies and successful surgeries. But today, Aaliyah could see something was wrong. "Dr. Foster, are you all right?" Aaliyah asked, her voice filled with concern. "You look upset." Dr. Foster hesitated for a moment, unsure how to explain what had just happened without sounding like she was making excuses or seeking pity. But Aaliyah's kind eyes and genuine concern broke through her defenses. "I just had an encounter in the gift shop that was troubling," Dr. Foster said finally. "The manager refused to believe I was a doctor and called security on me." Aaliyah's eyes widened in shock and anger. "He did what? Robert Sterling. That man has always been difficult, but this is beyond the pale. Did you report it?" "I'm going to," Dr. Foster replied, her voice growing stronger with each word. "But first, I need to check on Mrs. Patterson. She's scheduled for surgery this afternoon, and her family will be worried." It was typical of Dr. Foster to put her patients first, even in the midst of her own crisis. This dedication to healing, this unwavering commitment to those in her care, was what had driven her to excel in a field where she was often the only black woman in the room. It was what had sustained her through medical school when professors questioned whether she belonged there, through residency when colleagues assumed she was a diversity hire rather than one of the most talented surgeons in the program. Mrs. Patterson, a 67-year-old grandmother from the suburbs, had been admitted 3 days earlier with a severe heart condition that required immediate surgical intervention. Dr. Foster had spent hours explaining the procedure to both the patient and her worried family, answering their questions with patience and compassion that went far beyond what was strictly required. "Dr. Foster!" Mrs. Patterson's daughter exclaimed as she entered the room. "Thank goodness you're here. Mom's been asking for you all morning." Dr. Foster felt some of the tension leave her shoulders as she focused on what truly mattered. This was why she had become a doctor, why she had endured years of discrimination and doubt. For moments like this, when her skills and dedication could make a real difference in someone's life. "How are you feeling today, Mrs. Patterson?" Dr. Foster asked, her voice warm and reassuring as she checked the monitors and examined her patient. "Much better now that you're here," Mrs. Patterson replied with a weak smile. "I was worried you might not be my surgeon anymore." The innocence of the comment hit Dr. Foster like a punch to the gut. Here was a woman who trusted her completely, who didn't care about the color of her skin or question her credentials. All Mrs. Patterson cared about was getting better, and she had faith that Dr. Foster would make that happen. "I'm not going anywhere," Dr. Foster assured her, squeezing the older woman's hand gently. "We're going to take excellent care of you." After spending time with Mrs. Patterson and her family, Dr. Foster made her way to her office, a small but comfortable space that reflected her personality and achievements. Medical journals lined the shelves, alongside photographs of her family and commendations from the hospital board recognizing her exceptional service. A framed copy of her medical degree from Johns Hopkins held a place of honor on the wall behind her desk, a reminder of how far she had come and how hard she had worked to get there. She sat down heavily in her chair and pulled out her phone, scrolling through the messages that had begun accumulating while she was with her patient. Word traveled fast in a hospital, and it seemed that news of the incident in the gift shop was already spreading. Several colleagues had texted expressing their support and outrage, while others were asking if the rumors they had heard were true. One message in particular caught her attention. It was from Terrence Johnson, one of the few black members of the hospital's board of directors and someone Dr. Foster had worked with on several community outreach programs. "Melanie, I heard about what happened this morning. This is unacceptable. We need to talk. Can you meet me in the boardroom in an hour?" Dr. Foster stared at the message for a long moment, feeling a mixture of relief and apprehension. Relief that someone in a position of power was taking the incident seriously, and apprehension about what would come next. She had never been one to make waves or demand special treatment, preferring to let her work speak for itself. But this situation was different. This was about more than just her personal dignity. It was about the message being sent to other minority professionals, to patients and families who looked like her, and to anyone who might face similar discrimination in the future. She typed back quickly, "I'll be there." The hour passed slowly as Dr. Foster tried to focus on patient files and administrative tasks, but her mind kept drifting back to Robert Sterling's words, to the look of suspicion and disgust in his eyes, to the scattered identification cards on the gift shop floor. She had faced discrimination before, but it had usually been subtle, coded language and plausible deniability. This had been different. This had been overt, public, and undeniably racist. When the time came for her meeting with Terrence Johnson, Dr. Foster made her way to the boardroom with measured steps. The space was intimidating, with its long mahogany table, leather chairs, and oil paintings of the hospital's founders and benefactors lining the walls. It was a room where million-dollar decisions were made, where the future of healthcare in their community was shaped. Terrence Johnson was already there, waiting for her with a grave expression on his face. A man in his early 60s with graying temples and kind eyes, Johnson had built his reputation as a fair and principled leader, both in his business dealings and in his service to the community. He had been one of the strongest advocates for diversity and inclusion on the hospital board, often finding himself in the minority when pushing for progressive changes. "Melanie," he said, standing as she entered the room, "thank you for coming. Please sit down." Dr. Foster took a seat across from him, folding her hands on the polished table surface. "I assume you've heard what happened this morning." "I've heard several versions," Johnson replied carefully. "But I'd like to hear it directly from you. Tell me exactly what occurred." Dr. Foster recounted the incident in detail, from her initial attempt to purchase flowers for her mother to Sterling's refusal to believe her credentials to the eventual involvement of security. She spoke calmly and factually, but Johnson could hear the hurt and anger beneath her composed exterior. When she finished, Johnson was quiet for a long moment, his jaw tight with barely controlled fury. "This is absolutely unacceptable," he said finally. "Not only is it a clear case of discrimination, but it's also a public relations nightmare for the hospital. Do you know if anyone recorded the incident?" "There were several people with phones out," Dr. Foster confirmed. "I wouldn't be surprised if it ends up on social media." Johnson rubbed his temples, clearly contemplating the ramifications. "We need to act quickly and decisively. This can't be allowed to stand, and we need to make sure everyone understands that this behavior doesn't represent the values of Mercy General Hospital." "What are you proposing?" Dr. Foster asked. "First, we need to conduct a formal investigation into Mr. Sterling's conduct. Second, we need to issue a public statement making it clear that discrimination of any kind will not be tolerated. And third, we need to review our policies and training procedures to make sure something like this never happens again." Dr. Foster nodded, feeling a sense of validation that her concerns were being taken seriously. "I appreciate your support, Terrence. I know this puts you in a difficult position." Johnson's expression hardened. "No, Melanie. Robert Sterling put the hospital in a difficult position. You were simply trying to buy flowers for your mother while wearing your hospital credentials. The fact that he couldn't see past his own prejudices to recognize one of our most talented physicians is his failure, not yours." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock on the boardroom door. Catherine Reynolds, the hospital's chief administrator, entered with the expression of barely controlled panic on her face. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, "but we have a problem. The incident from this morning has been posted on social media, and it's going viral. We're getting calls from reporters, and our public relations department is in full crisis mode." Dr. Foster felt her stomach drop. She had hoped to handle this matter quietly, internally, without drawing public attention to herself or the hospital. But in today's world of smartphones and social media, privacy was often an impossible luxury. "How bad is it?" Johnson asked. Reynolds pulled out her tablet and showed them a video that had already been viewed thousands of times. The footage was shaky and the audio wasn't perfect, but it clearly showed Sterling berating Dr. Foster, refusing to acknowledge her credentials, and calling for security. The comments below the video were a mixture of outrage, support for Dr. Foster, and, unfortunately, some that echoed Sterling's discriminatory attitudes. "This is exactly what we were afraid of," Johnson said grimly. "We need to get ahead of this story before it completely spirals out of control." Dr. Foster watched the video with a sick feeling in her stomach. Seeing herself being humiliated and diminished was painful enough, but knowing that thousands of strangers were now witnessing her degradation made it somehow worse. She thought about her patients, her colleagues, her family members who might see this video and feel secondhand embarrassment or anger on her behalf. "What do you need from me?" she asked, her voice steady despite the turmoil she felt inside. "Right now, nothing," Johnson replied. "Let us handle the immediate response, but I want you to know that we're going to make this right, Melanie. This hospital has a responsibility to protect its staff from discrimination, and we failed you today." As Dr. Foster left the boardroom, she felt a complex mixture of emotions. There was relief that the hospital administration was taking the incident seriously, anger that it had happened in the first place, and anxiety about what the coming days would bring. She knew that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't predict or control. But there was also something else, something that surprised her with its intensity: determination. Dr. Melanie Foster had not worked this hard and come this far to be diminished by the prejudices of one small-minded man. Whatever came next, she would face it with the same courage and dignity that had carried her through every challenge in her life. The truth, she knew, had a way of prevailing, and she was ready to fight for it. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of David Crawford's corner office, casting long shadows across the mahogany desk where the hospital board chairman sat reviewing the crisis that had erupted overnight. Crawford, a distinguished man in his late 60s with silver hair and steel-gray eyes, had built his reputation on methodical decision-making and unwavering principles. As the grandson of one of the hospital's founders and someone who had dedicated his entire career to healthcare administration, he understood that the actions taken in the next few days would define not only the hospital's immediate future, but its moral legacy. The social media explosion had been swift and merciless. The video of Dr. Melanie Foster being confronted and humiliated in the hospital gift shop had been shared thousands of times across multiple platforms, spawning hashtags like #DoctorDenied and #MercyGeneralShame. News outlets were picking up the story, medical organizations were issuing statements of support, and the hospital's phone lines were jammed with calls from outraged community members, potential patients reconsidering their healthcare choices, and reporters seeking official statements. Crawford's assistant knocked gently on the door before entering with a stack of newspapers and printed social media reports. "Sir, the story has made the front page of both the Tribune and the Herald. The television stations are running it as their lead story, and we've received interview requests from 3 national news programs." Crawford nodded grimly as he scanned the headlines. Prominent black surgeon accused of impersonation at own hospital. Discrimination caught on camera at Mercy General. And when healing hands are seen as threatening, a doctor's humiliation goes viral. Each story painted the hospital in an increasingly negative light, questioning not only the specific incident but the broader culture and policies that had allowed it to occur. His phone buzzed with an urgent text from Catherine Reynolds. "Emergency board meeting in 30 minutes. We need immediate action plan." Crawford understood the gravity of the situation extended far beyond public relations damage control. This was about the fundamental values of the institution he had helped lead for over 2 decades. Mercy General had always prided itself on being a place where excellence in medicine was the only measure that mattered, where patients received the best possible care regardless of their background, and where staff members were valued for their skills and dedication rather than their demographics. The emergency board meeting convened in the hospital's largest conference room, with members participating both in person and via video conference. The tension in the room was palpable as the 12-member board, representing various constituencies including physicians, community leaders, and major donors, grappled with the crisis that had engulfed their institution. Terrence Johnson, who had spoken with Dr. Foster the previous day, was the first to address the group. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are facing not just a public relations crisis, but a fundamental challenge to our values and credibility. One of our most accomplished physicians, a woman who has saved countless lives and brought honor to this institution, was subjected to blatant racial discrimination by a member of our staff." Dr. Michael Henderson, the chief of medicine and a longtime board member, shook his head in disgust. "I've worked with Dr. Foster for years. She's one of the finest surgeons I've ever encountered, with an impeccable record and the respect of everyone in the medical community. The idea that anyone would question her legitimacy is not just offensive, it's absurd." Margaret Foster, representing the hospital's major donors, expressed concern about the financial implications. "I've already received calls from 3 major benefactors questioning whether they want to continue their association with the hospital. The Patterson family, who pledged $5 million for the new cardiac wing, are reconsidering their commitment. Crawford listened to each board member's concerns before calling for order. We need to approach this systematically. First, we must ensure that a thorough investigation is conducted into Mr. Sterling's actions and the circumstances that allowed this to occur. Second, we need to take immediate steps to support Dr. Foster and demonstrate our commitment to our values. Third, we must implement changes to prevent similar incidents in the future. Catherine Reynolds presented the initial findings of her preliminary investigation. Robert Sterling has been employed as gift shop manager for 9 years. His personnel file shows no previous complaints of racial discrimination, but there have been several incidents of rudeness and unprofessional behavior toward visitors. More concerning, I've discovered that Sterling has never attended any of our mandatory diversity and inclusion training sessions, claiming scheduling conflicts each time. The revelation drew angry murmurs from several board members. The hospital had implemented comprehensive diversity training following a previous incident involving a security guard who had profiled minority visitors. The fact that Sterling had systematically avoided this training while managing a public-facing facility was seen as a serious oversight. Who was responsible for ensuring Sterling's compliance with training requirements? Crawford asked. Reynolds consulted her notes. The gift shop technically falls under retail operations, which reports to facilities management. It appears there was confusion about which department was responsible for ensuring training compliance for gift shop staff. Johnson leaned forward in his chair, his voice tight with controlled anger. So we have a man with a history of unprofessional behavior who avoided diversity training, managing a facility where he interacts with staff, patients, and families every day? How was this allowed to continue? The uncomfortable silence that followed spoke volumes about the institutional failures that had contributed to the crisis. Crawford made notes on his legal pad, already formulating the comprehensive review that would be necessary to address the systemic issues the incident had revealed. Dr. Lisa Park, the hospital's chief diversity officer, had been conducting her own investigation since learning of the incident. I've spoken with several staff members who work near the gift shop, she reported. Multiple people have described Sterling as suspicious and unwelcoming toward minority visitors and staff. One nurse told me she stopped referring families to the gift shop because Sterling's attitude was so consistently negative toward Black and Hispanic families. The accumulating evidence painted a picture of systemic failure that extended well beyond one man's prejudiced actions. The board was beginning to understand that this crisis represented a fundamental breakdown in the hospital's oversight and accountability systems. Crawford called for a brief recess, during which he stepped into his office to place a call to Zara Mitchell, one of the city's most respected civil rights attorneys. Mitchell had represented several high-profile discrimination cases and was known for her principled approach to seeking justice rather than simply maximizing settlements or publicity. Ms. Mitchell, Crawford began, I'm sure you're aware of the incident at our hospital involving Dr. Melanie Foster. I want you to know that we take this matter extremely seriously, and we're committed to conducting a thorough investigation and taking appropriate action. Mitchell's response was measured but firm. Mr. Crawford, I appreciate your call. Dr. Foster has not yet retained legal representation, but several attorneys have reached out to her. What she wants is not financial compensation, but assurance that this will never happen to another healthcare professional or patient at your institution. That's exactly what we want as well, Crawford replied. We're implementing immediate changes and conducting a comprehensive review of our policies and procedures. I hope Dr. Foster will work with us to ensure meaningful reform rather than pursuing adversarial legal proceedings. Dr. Foster is a healer, not a litigant, Mitchell said, but she's also not going to allow this incident to be minimized or forgotten. If your actions match your words, I believe we can find a path forward that serves everyone's interests. When the board meeting reconvened, Crawford shared his conversation with Mitchell and outlined the immediate steps the hospital would take. Effective immediately, Robert Sterling is suspended pending the completion of our investigation. We will conduct exit interviews with all gift shop staff to identify any patterns of discriminatory behavior. We will also implement mandatory monthly diversity training for all staff, with no exceptions for scheduling conflicts. But the board members knew that these reactive measures, while necessary, were insufficient to address the deeper issues the incident had revealed. They needed to demonstrate genuine commitment to change, not merely damage control. Terrence Johnson proposed a more comprehensive approach. We should establish a patient and staff advocacy office, headed by Dr. Foster if she's willing, to proactively identify and address issues of discrimination and bias. We need to move beyond simply responding to crises to actively preventing them. The suggestion was met with unanimous approval, but several board members wondered whether Dr. Foster would be interested in taking on such a role given what she had experienced. Her primary passion was surgery, saving lives, and advancing cardiac medicine. Would she be willing to take on the additional burden of institutional reform? Crawford made another note on his legal pad. I'll speak with Dr. Foster directly about our proposals, but first we need to issue a public statement taking full responsibility for this incident and outlining our commitment to change. The statement that emerged from the emergency meeting was unlike anything the hospital had previously issued. Rather than the typical corporate language of regret and investigation, it was a direct acknowledgement of failure and a specific commitment to reform. Mercy General Hospital categorically condemns the discriminatory treatment experienced by Dr. Melanie Foster, one of our most accomplished physicians. The actions of our gift shop manager were not only morally reprehensible, but also contrary to every value our institution represents. We take full responsibility for the systemic failures that allowed this incident to occur, and we are committed to implementing comprehensive reforms to ensure it never happens again. Dr. Foster deserves not only our apology but our deepest gratitude for her years of dedicated service to our patients and community. The statement went on to detail specific actions the hospital was taking, including Sterling's suspension, a comprehensive review of hiring and training practices, and the establishment of new oversight mechanisms to prevent similar incidents. But as Crawford reviewed the final draft before its public release, he knew that words alone would not be sufficient to restore the hospital's reputation or, more importantly, to repair the harm done to Dr. Foster. The real test would come in the days and weeks ahead, as the institution worked to transform its culture and demonstrate that its commitment to equality was more than just public relations rhetoric. The investigation was just beginning, but already it had revealed uncomfortable truths about the gaps between the hospital's stated values and its daily practices. The question now was whether Mercy General Hospital had the courage and commitment to confront these failures honestly and implement meaningful change, or whether this would become just another crisis managed and forgotten. Dr. Melanie Foster, meanwhile, continued her work in cardiac surgery, saving lives and maintaining her professional excellence even as the storm swirled around her. She had not yet decided how to respond to the hospital's overtures or whether to trust that their promises of reform would translate into genuine change. But she knew that whatever path she chose, it would be guided by the same principles that had always defined her career: integrity, compassion, and an unwavering commitment to doing what was right. The truth, as she had learned long ago, had a way of emerging. The question was whether people would have the courage to act on it once it was revealed. The video of Dr. Melanie Foster's humiliation in the Mercy General Hospital gift shop had ignited a firestorm that extended far beyond the hospital walls. Within 48 hours of its initial posting, the footage had been viewed over 2 million times, shared across every major social media platform, and become a rallying point for conversations about racism in healthcare, professional discrimination, and institutional accountability. At the Community Health Coalition's downtown office, Director Yvonne Carter was fielding calls from concerned citizens, medical professionals, and advocacy groups from across the country. The coalition, which had long worked to address healthcare disparities in underserved communities, had been inundated with requests for action, support for Dr. Foster, and demands for systemic change at Mercy General Hospital. "We've received over 3,000 emails in the past 2 days," Carter explained to her assistant, Marcus Williams, as they reviewed the overwhelming response. Medical students, nurses, physicians from around the country, all sharing their own experiences with workplace discrimination. This has clearly touched a nerve that goes far beyond just one incident. The coalition's phones had been ringing non-stop since the video went viral. Healthcare workers were sharing stories of their own encounters with prejudice. Patients were expressing concern about whether they could trust hospitals to treat them fairly. And community leaders were demanding action to address what many saw as a symptom of a much larger problem. Dr. Patricia Williams, president of the National Medical Association, had issued a statement calling the incident a stark reminder that even our most accomplished professionals are not immune to the poison of racial prejudice. The American College of Surgeons had condemned the treatment of Dr. Foster, and medical schools across the country were using the incident as a teaching moment about bias in healthcare settings. But perhaps the most powerful response was coming from Dr. Foster's own colleagues and patients. The cardiac surgery department at Mercy General had been flooded with letters and flowers from grateful families whose loved ones had been saved by Dr. Foster's skill and compassion. Former patients were sharing their stories on social media, describing not just her medical expertise, but her kindness, patience, and unwavering professionalism in the face of life and death situations. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly patient Dr. Foster was scheduled to operate on, had watched the video with tears in her eyes. "That's my doctor," she told her daughter. "That's the woman who's going to save my life, and someone treated her like she was a criminal. It breaks my heart." The outpouring of support was overwhelming, but it also highlighted the painful reality that Dr. Foster's experience was far from unique. Healthcare professionals of color across the country were sharing their own stories of being questioned, doubted, and diminished by colleagues, patients, and hospital staff who couldn't see past their skin color to recognize their qualifications and dedication. Dr. James Mitchell, chief of cardiology at a prominent hospital in Chicago, posted a lengthy response on social media describing his own experiences. "I have been stopped by security in my own hospital more times than I can count. I have had patients request a real doctor when they saw me enter their room. I have been mistaken for an orderly, a janitor, a food service worker, everything except what I actually am, a physician who has dedicated his life to healing others." The stories kept coming, creating a devastating portrait of a healthcare system that, despite its commitment to healing, was still infected by the same prejudices that plagued society as a whole. Nurses described being ignored during medical emergencies because other staff assumed they weren't qualified to provide input. Residents talked about having their diagnoses questioned more frequently than their white counterparts. Attending physicians shared experiences of being mistaken for students or support staff by patients and colleagues alike. At Mercy General Hospital, the impact of the viral video was being felt throughout every department. Catherine Reynolds found herself in crisis management mode, coordinating responses to media inquiries while trying to maintain normal hospital operations. The Public Relations Department was working around the clock to address the negative publicity, but they were fighting an uphill battle against the raw emotional power of the video footage. Meanwhile, Robert Sterling remained suspended and largely hidden from public view, though reporters had managed to locate his home address and were camped outside, hoping for a comment or statement. Sterling's few public defenders argued that he was being unfairly vilified for what they characterized as an honest mistake, but their voices were drowned out by the overwhelming condemnation of his actions. The investigation into Sterling's conduct was revealing a troubling pattern of behavior that extended well beyond his treatment of Dr. Foster. James Morrison, the head of hospital security, had conducted interviews with staff members who worked near the gift shop and uncovered multiple instances of inappropriate conduct. "I've spoken with 12 employees so far," Morrison reported to Crawford and the board. 7 of them described Sterling as consistently rude and suspicious toward minority visitors. 3 specifically mentioned incidents where he questioned the legitimacy of Black or Hispanic family members trying to visit patients, demanding extra identification or proof of relationship. One particularly disturbing account came from Susan Palmer, a volunteer who worked in the patient information center adjacent to the gift shop. She described an incident from 6 months earlier where Sterling had called security on a young Black man who was trying to buy a teddy bear for his sick daughter. The man showed his ID, explained that his daughter was a patient in pediatrics, even had his visitor's badge clearly visible, Palmer recounted. But Robert kept insisting something wasn't right, that the man looked suspicious. "It was obviously racial profiling, but when I tried to intervene, Robert told me to mind my own business." The investigation was also revealing institutional failures that had allowed Sterling's problematic behavior to continue unchecked. Despite multiple informal complaints about his attitude and conduct, no formal disciplinary action had ever been taken. The gift shop's location in the hospital's main lobby made Sterling one of the first faces many visitors encountered. Yet there had been minimal oversight of his interactions with the public. Dr. Foster, meanwhile, was struggling with the unwanted attention her ordeal had generated. She had entered medicine to heal patients and advance cardiac surgery, not to become a symbol or spokesperson for racial justice in healthcare. The constant media requests, social media mentions, and public scrutiny were exhausting for someone who preferred to let her work speak for itself. Her colleagues in the cardiac surgery department had rallied around her with overwhelming support. Dr. Henderson had personally called every member of the medical staff to express the hospital's backing of Dr. Foster and to gather information about any similar incidents they might have witnessed or experienced. The responses had been both reassuring and troubling, confirming that while Dr. Foster was widely respected and valued by her medical colleagues, the hospital's support staff and administrative personnel had not always extended the same level of professional courtesy. The nursing staff in particular had been vocal in their support. Aaliyah Washington had organized a petition signed by over 200 nurses, physician assistants, and support staff affirming their confidence in Dr. Foster and demanding accountability for the discrimination she had faced. The petition was delivered to Crawford's office along with dozens of letters describing Dr. Foster's professionalism, skill, and compassionate patient care. "Dr. Foster saved my father's life," wrote one letter from a recovery room nurse. "She spent 3 hours in surgery repairing damage that other surgeons said was inoperable. When my family was told there was nothing more that could be done, Dr. Foster gave us hope and then delivered on that hope. The idea that anyone would question her qualifications or treat her with anything less than the utmost respect is not just offensive, it's dangerous to patients who need her expertise." The broader medical community was also taking notice. The American Heart Association announced that they would be presenting Dr. Foster with their Distinguished Service Award at their annual conference, specifically citing her contributions to cardiac surgery and her dignity in the face of discrimination. Medical schools were inviting her to speak about both her surgical innovations and her experiences with bias in healthcare, but perhaps the most meaningful response came from her patients. The cardiac surgery department's waiting room was filled with flowers, cards, and gifts from families whose loved ones had been treated by Dr. Foster. Many included photographs of healthy family members who were alive because of her skill, along with heartfelt messages of gratitude and support. One card from the family of a heart transplant patient read, "Dr. Foster, you gave us a miracle when you saved our daughter's life. The fact that someone would treat you with anything less than the highest respect shows their ignorance, not your worth. You are a hero to our family and to countless others." These expressions of support provided some comfort to Dr. Foster, but they also reinforced the weight of responsibility she felt. She understood that her response to this incident would impact not just her own career, but the experiences of other minority healthcare professionals who would follow in her footsteps. The decision about how to proceed was not just personal. It was a choice that would ripple through the medical community and potentially influence how similar incidents were handled in the future. As the community continued to rally around her and demand accountability from Mercy General Hospital, Dr. Foster found herself at a crossroads. She could pursue legal action that would likely result in financial compensation and public vindication. She could accept the hospital's apologies and reforms while returning to her normal practice. Or she could use this moment as a catalyst for broader change, working within the system to ensure that other healthcare professionals would never face the humiliation and discrimination she had endured. The choice she made would define not just her own future, but the legacy of this moment in the ongoing struggle for equality in healthcare. And as she prepared to meet with the hospital board to discuss their proposed reforms, Dr. Foster knew that whatever path she chose, it would be guided by the same principles that had always defined her career: integrity, compassion, and an unwavering commitment to doing what was right for all patients and professionals who would come after her. The emergency session of Mercy General Hospital's Board of Directors convened at 7 in the morning, 3 days after the incident that had thrust their institution into the national spotlight. The usual formality of board meetings had been replaced by an atmosphere of urgent crisis management, with members arriving early and staying late as they grappled with the most serious challenge to the hospital's reputation in its century-long history. David Crawford entered the boardroom carrying a thick folder of documents, media clippings, and legal analyses that had been compiled by his staff through sleepless nights of damage control and strategic planning. The silver-haired chairman looked older than his 68 years, the weight of institutional responsibility clearly taking its toll as he faced the possibility that his leadership might be remembered not for the hospital's medical achievements, but for its failure to protect one of its most distinguished physicians from racial discrimination. The assembled board members represented a cross-section of the community's most influential leaders. Prominent physicians, business executives, civic leaders, and major donors who had invested both their resources and their reputations in Mercy General's mission. But this morning, their usual confidence was tempered by the uncomfortable recognition that their institution had failed to live up to its own stated values. "Ladies and gentlemen," Crawford began, his voice carrying the gravity of the moment, "we are here to address not just a crisis of public relations, but a fundamental failure of our institutional culture. The discrimination faced by Dr. Melanie Foster represents a breakdown in our systems, our oversight, and our commitment to the principles that should guide every aspect of our operation." Terrence Johnson, who had become Dr. Foster's strongest advocate on the board, presented the findings of the expedited investigation that had been conducted over the past 72 hours. The results were more damning than even the harshest critics had imagined. Robert Sterling's personnel file reveals a pattern of complaints dating back 5 years, Johnson reported, his voice tight with controlled anger. 17 separate incidents of inappropriate conduct toward minority visitors, staff, and vendors. In each case, the complaints were noted, but no disciplinary action was taken. Sterling was counseled twice about his attitude, attended one diversity training session in his entire 9-year tenure, and was actually recommended for a performance bonus last year despite these documented problems. The board members exchanged uncomfortable glances as Johnson continued his presentation. The investigation had also revealed that Sterling's supervisor, retail operations manager Kevin Hayes, had been aware of multiple complaints but had consistently minimized their significance, describing them as personality conflicts rather than potential discrimination. Hayes told investigators that Sterling was just old-fashioned and set in his ways, Johnson continued. He dismissed concerns about Sterling's treatment of minority visitors as oversensitivity and defended him as a loyal employee who just needed better people skills. This represents a complete failure of management oversight and accountability. Dr. Henderson, the chief of medicine, shook his head in disgust as he reviewed the investigation findings. "I've worked alongside Dr. Foster for years. She's published groundbreaking research, trained dozens of residents, and has one of the lowest surgical mortality rates in the country. The idea that anyone in this institution would question her credentials is not just offensive, it's medically dangerous. Patients depend on our ability to recognize and utilize the expertise of all our staff." Margaret Foster, representing the hospital's major donors, presented the financial implications of the crisis with stark clarity. "We've lost 2 major donor commitments totaling $8 million. 3 corporate sponsors have suspended their relationships with the hospital pending resolution of this matter. Our patient satisfaction scores have dropped 15% in just 3 days, and we're seeing a significant decline in appointment bookings, particularly among minority patients." The financial impact was significant, but Crawford understood that the deeper damage was to the hospital's moral authority and community trust. Mercy General had built its reputation on being a place where medical excellence transcended social barriers, where patients could expect the highest quality care regardless of their background. The Sterling incident had shattered that carefully cultivated image and raised uncomfortable questions about the hospital's true commitment to equality. Catherine Reynolds presented the media analysis, which painted an increasingly bleak picture of public perception. "The story has been covered by every major news outlet in the country," she reported. "Medical journals are running editorials about discrimination in healthcare. Patient advocacy groups are calling for investigations into our hiring and training practices. We're facing potential reviews by state health department officials and accreditation organizations. But perhaps most troubling was the response from the medical community itself. Prominent physicians were canceling speaking engagements at hospital conferences. Medical students were withdrawing applications for residency programs, and several department heads had received calls from colleagues at other institutions questioning whether Mercy General was a place where minority professionals could expect fair treatment. Dr. Lisa Park, the Chief Diversity Officer, had been working around the clock to assess the broader cultural issues that had contributed to the crisis. Her preliminary findings suggested that the Sterling incident was not an isolated failure but symptomatic of deeper institutional problems. "I've conducted confidential interviews with 43 staff members across all departments," Park reported. While the vast majority describe a generally inclusive environment, 17% reported witnessing or experiencing incidents they perceived as discriminatory. Most concerning, 68% said they wouldn't feel comfortable reporting discrimination if they experienced or witnessed it, citing fears of retaliation or skepticism that their concerns would be taken seriously. The statistics painted a troubling picture of an institution that, despite its stated commitment to diversity and inclusion, had failed to create an environment where all employees felt safe and valued. The board members realized they were not just dealing with one problematic employee, but with systemic failures that had allowed discrimination to flourish unchecked. Crawford called for a brief recess, during which he placed another call to Zara Mitchell, the civil rights attorney who had been monitoring the situation on Dr. Foster's behalf. The conversation was tense but productive, with both parties recognizing that their interests were ultimately aligned in ensuring meaningful reform rather than prolonged litigation. "Dr. Foster is not interested in financial compensation," Mitchell explained. "What she wants is assurance that this institution will take concrete steps to prevent similar incidents in the future. She's prepared to work with the hospital on reforms, but only if there's genuine commitment to change, not just public relations damage control." Crawford felt a surge of respect for Dr. Foster's principled approach. Lesser individuals might have seized the opportunity for personal gain or public vindication, but she was focused on institutional improvement and protecting future colleagues from similar treatment. When the board meeting reconvened, Crawford outlined the comprehensive reform package that would be necessary to address the crisis and prevent future incidents. The proposals went far beyond simple personnel changes to encompass fundamental shifts in hospital culture and operations. First, Crawford announced, we will terminate Robert Sterling immediately and conduct a comprehensive review of all retail operations personnel. Kevin Hayes will also be removed from his supervisory position for his failure to address documented problems. We cannot allow managers who minimize or ignore discrimination to continue in leadership roles. The board members nodded their approval, understanding that symbolic gestures would not be sufficient to restore public trust. Real change would require real consequences for those who had enabled or perpetrated discrimination. Second, Crawford continued, we will establish a new position, Chief Equality Officer, reporting directly to the Board of Directors. This individual will have authority to investigate discrimination complaints, review hiring and promotion practices, and implement corrective measures without interference from department managers. Terrence Johnson raised his hand. Have you considered offering this position to Dr. Foster? Given her experience and her standing in the medical community, she would bring both credibility and expertise to the role. Crawford nodded. We intend to make that offer, though we understand she may prefer to focus on her surgical practice. If she declines, we'll conduct a national search for someone with equivalent qualifications and commitment. The third component of the reform package addressed the training and accountability systems that had so clearly failed in Sterling's case. Every employee will be required to complete comprehensive bias awareness training within 60 days, Crawford explained. This will not be optional, and failure to complete the training will result in suspension without pay. Additionally, all supervisors will receive special training on recognizing and addressing discriminatory behavior. Dr. Henderson suggested an even more ambitious approach. We should also implement regular bias assessments using external consultants, similar to the financial audits we conduct annually. An outside perspective might identify problems we're too close to see. The board approved this suggestion unanimously, recognizing that internal oversight had proven insufficient to prevent the current crisis. The fourth element of the reform package addressed communication and reporting systems. We will establish multiple channels for reporting discrimination, including an anonymous hotline staffed by external counselors, Crawford announced. All complaints will be investigated within 30 days, with findings reported directly to the board. There will be zero tolerance for retaliation against individuals who report discrimination in good faith. As the meeting progressed, the board members found themselves confronting uncomfortable truths about their institution's culture and their own oversight responsibilities. Many admitted they had been aware of Sterling's problematic behavior but had dismissed it as a personality quirk rather than recognizing it as potential discrimination. We failed, Dr. Foster, Johnson said quietly. But more importantly, we failed our mission. Hospitals exist to heal and serve all people, regardless of their background. When we allow discrimination to flourish in our institutions, we betray that sacred trust. The final element of the reform package was perhaps the most significant, a commitment to transparency and ongoing accountability. We will publish annual diversity and inclusion reports, including demographic data on staff hiring, promotion, and retention, Crawford announced. We will also track patient satisfaction scores by demographic group to ensure equitable treatment. This information will be made publicly available to demonstrate our commitment to continuous improvement. Margaret Foster raised concerns about the financial implications of the comprehensive reforms. These initiatives will require significant investment at a time when we're already facing budget pressures from the current crisis. How do we justify the expense to our donors and stakeholders? Crawford's response was unequivocal. We justify it by recognizing that our reputation and moral authority are our most valuable assets. The cost of implementing these reforms is minimal compared to the ongoing damage from discrimination scandals. More importantly, it's simply the right thing to do. As the board meeting concluded, Crawford felt cautiously optimistic that they had developed a comprehensive response to the crisis. But he also understood that announcing reforms was easy. Implementing them effectively and sustaining them over time would be the real test of the hospital's commitment. The next critical step would be his meeting with Dr. Foster to present the reform package and offer her the Chief Equality Officer position. Her response would largely determine whether Mercy General Hospital could move forward as a reformed institution or would remain forever tainted by its failure to protect one of its most accomplished physicians. But regardless of her decision, Crawford was determined that Robert Sterling's discriminatory actions would mark a turning point in the hospital's history. Never again would Mercy General Hospital allow prejudice to masquerade as policy or discrimination to hide behind institutional indifference. The truth had been revealed, and now it was time to act upon it with the courage and conviction that the situation demanded. The healing process, both for Dr. Foster and for the institution itself, was about to begin. The morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows of Dr. Melanie Foster's office as she sat quietly reviewing the comprehensive reform proposal that David Crawford had hand-delivered the previous evening. The 40-page document represented what appeared to be a genuine commitment to institutional change. But Dr. Foster had learned through years of navigating predominantly white medical institutions that promises on paper didn't always translate into meaningful action. Her desk was covered with letters of support from colleagues, patients, and medical professionals around the country, each one reminding her that her decision would impact far more than just her own career. The weight of that responsibility sat heavily on her shoulders as she considered the hospital's offer to become their Chief Equality Officer, a position that would fundamentally change the trajectory of her professional life. A gentle knock on her door interrupted her contemplation. Aaliyah Washington entered, carrying 2 cups of coffee and the kind of knowing smile that came from years of working closely together in high-pressure situations. "Thought you might need some caffeine," Aaliyah said, settling into the chair across from Dr. Foster's desk. "You've been holed up in here since yesterday evening. The entire cardiac unit is buzzing with speculation about what you're going to decide." Dr. Foster accepted the coffee gratefully, using the moment to gather her thoughts. "It's a generous offer," she said finally. "More than generous, actually. They're essentially asking me to reshape the entire culture of this institution." "Is that what you want to do?" Aaliyah asked directly. She had known Dr. Foster long enough to recognize the signs of internal conflict, the careful weighing of options that characterized her approach to difficult decisions. "I became a doctor to save lives," Dr. Foster replied, her voice reflecting the uncertainty she felt. "I've spent 15 years building my surgical skills, conducting research, training the next generation of cardiac surgeons. Taking this position would mean stepping away from all of that to become an administrator, a policymaker, a symbol." Aaliyah leaned forward, her expression serious. "But you'd also be ensuring that no other doctor, nurse, or healthcare professional would have to face what you experienced. You'd be protecting patients from the kind of discrimination that could literally cost them their lives if staff members' biases affect their care decisions." The point resonated deeply with Dr. Foster. She had seen firsthand how unconscious bias could influence medical decision-making, how assumptions about patients' intelligence, compliance, or pain tolerance could lead to substandard care. If accepting this position could help address those systemic problems, it might ultimately save more lives than she could in the operating room. Her contemplation was interrupted by another knock on the door. This time it was Dr. Henderson, the chief of medicine, whose face showed the strain of the past week's events. "Melanie," he said, settling heavily into a chair, "I hope you'll forgive the intrusion, but I felt I needed to speak with you before you make your decision about Crawford's offer." Dr. Foster nodded, gesturing for him to continue. "I've been in medicine for 35 years, Dr. Henderson began. I've seen talented physicians leave the profession because of discrimination. I've watched promising careers derailed by bias, and I've witnessed the damage that prejudice can do to both patients and providers. What happened to you was inexcusable, but your response to it has been remarkable." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "If you take this position, you'll be giving up your surgical practice at the peak of your career. That's an enormous sacrifice. But you'll also be in a position to create change that could impact thousands of healthcare professionals and millions of patients over the coming decades." Dr. Foster had been wrestling with this same calculation since receiving Crawford's proposal. The Chief Equality Officer position would come with a substantial salary increase, significant institutional authority, and the resources to implement comprehensive reforms. But it would also mean trading her identity as a surgeon for a role that, however important, felt far removed from the hands-on healing that had drawn her to medicine. "What would you do?" she asked Dr. Henderson directly. He was quiet for a long moment before responding. 20 years ago, I probably would have advised you to demand a financial settlement, transfer to another hospital, and continue your surgical career without looking back. But I've learned that sometimes the most important contributions we can make extend beyond our immediate professional goals." His words carried the weight of experience and regret, suggesting his own missed opportunities to address systemic problems he had witnessed throughout his career. After Dr. Henderson left, Dr. Foster found herself thinking about her mother, the woman who had worked 3 jobs to support her daughter's medical education and who had always emphasized the importance of using one's talents to lift up others. What would her mother advise in this situation? The answer came to her with startling clarity. Her mother would tell her to think beyond herself, to consider the young black girls who might one day dream of becoming doctors, the Hispanic nurses who deserved respect and recognition for their expertise, the Asian physicians who shouldn't have to prove their competence every day because of their accents or appearance. But before making her final decision, Dr. Foster knew she needed to have honest conversations with the people whose opinions mattered most to her. That afternoon, she called her mentor from medical school, Dr. Elizabeth Warren, a pioneering cardiac surgeon who had broken barriers in her own generation and who had guided Dr. Foster through the early challenges of her career. "Melanie," Dr. Warren said warmly when she answered the phone, "I've been following the news coverage, and I couldn't be more proud of how you've handled this situation. What can I do to help?" Dr. Foster explained the hospital's offer and her conflicted feelings about potentially leaving surgery for administration. Dr. Warren listened thoughtfully before responding. "When I was starting my career," Dr. Warren said, "there were virtually no women in cardiac surgery, let alone women of color. I focused solely on proving myself in the operating room, thinking that excellence would be enough to break down barriers. And to some extent, it was. But I realize now that I could have done more to create opportunities for others." She paused before continuing. "You have a chance to do something I never could, to use your platform and credibility to create systematic change that will benefit countless people. Yes, it means sacrificing some of your individual surgical practice, but it might be the most important work of your entire career." Evening, Dr. Foster called her mother to discuss the decision that would reshape her professional life. The conversation was brief but illuminating. "Baby," her mother said after hearing the details, "you didn't become a doctor just to help sick people get better. You became a doctor to make the world a more just place. Sometimes that happens one patient at a time in the operating room. Sometimes it happens by changing entire systems so that all patients get better care." The wisdom in those words crystallized Dr. Foster's thinking. She had indeed entered medicine not just to practice surgery, but to address healthcare disparities and ensure that all patients received excellent care regardless of their background. The Chief Equality Officer position would allow her to pursue that mission on a much larger scale. Her decision was further solidified by a conversation with Isaiah Thompson, the security guard who had been called to the gift shop during the initial incident. Thompson sought her out to express his regret about the situation and to share his own experiences with workplace discrimination. "Dr. Foster," he said, clearly uncomfortable but determined to speak, "I knew who you were that day, and I should have stood up for you more forcefully. I've been a security guard here for 12 years, and I've seen too many incidents like that one. I've watched good people be diminished and dismissed because of their race, and I've been too afraid of losing my job to speak up." His honesty was both painful and revealing. If experienced, well-meaning employees like Thompson felt unable to intervene when they witnessed discrimination, it suggested that the cultural problems at Mercy General were even deeper than the investigation had revealed. "If you take this position," Thompson continued, "maybe people like me will finally feel safe speaking up when we see injustice. Maybe we can create an environment where everyone is treated with dignity and respect." That night, Dr. Foster drafted her response to David Crawford's offer. The letter was carefully crafted, reflecting both her commitment to reform and her conditions for accepting the position. "Dear Mr. Crawford, I have carefully reviewed the hospital's reform proposal and your offer for me to serve as Chief Equality Officer. While I am encouraged by the comprehensive nature of the proposed changes, I want to be clear about what accepting this position would mean. This cannot be a symbolic appointment designed to improve public relations while maintaining the status quo. If I accept this role, I will expect complete authority to investigate discrimination, implement reforms, and hold all employees accountable for their actions, regardless of their position or tenure. I will also expect the hospital to commit to this work for the long term, not just until the current controversy subsides. Creating meaningful change will require sustained effort and resources over many years. Finally, I want to maintain some connection to clinical practice, perhaps by continuing to perform surgeries 1 day per week. Medicine is my calling, and I don't want to lose that connection to patient care entirely. If you can agree to these conditions, I am prepared to accept the position and dedicate myself to ensuring that Mercy General Hospital becomes a model for equality and inclusion in healthcare." As she sealed the letter, Dr. Foster felt a sense of peace about her decision. She was trading the certainty of surgical practice for the uncertainty of institutional reform, but she was doing so with the knowledge that her choice could create ripple effects that extended far beyond the walls of Mercy General Hospital. The next morning, she personally delivered the letter to Crawford's office, where she found him waiting with obvious anxiety about her decision. His relief was palpable when he read her acceptance, though he quickly understood the significance of her conditions. "These terms are more than fair," Crawford said after reviewing her letter. "They're exactly what we need to ensure this position has real authority and impact." "When can you start?" Dr. Foster smiled for the first time in weeks. "I'll need time to transition my surgical cases and set up the new department. Shall we say 60 days? Crawford nodded eagerly. "We'll announce your appointment this afternoon, along with the full reform package. I think you'll be surprised by the positive response." As Dr. Foster left Crawford's office, she felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. She was no longer just Dr. Melanie Foster, cardiac surgeon. She was about to become Dr. Melanie Foster, Chief Equality Officer, with the power and obligation to transform one of the country's most prestigious medical institutions. The journey ahead would be challenging, filled with resistance from those who preferred the status quo and skepticism from those who doubted her ability to create meaningful change. But Dr. Foster had faced challenges before, and she had never backed down from doing what was right. The truth had been revealed, and now it was time to act upon it with courage, determination, and an unwavering commitment to justice. The press conference was scheduled for 2 o'clock in the afternoon in Mercy General Hospital's main auditorium, a space typically reserved for medical conferences and educational seminars. Today, however, it would serve as the venue for what many observers expected to be either the beginning of meaningful institutional reform or an elaborate public relations exercise designed to minimize the damage from the Sterling incident. David Crawford stood at the podium, flanked by the hospital's senior leadership team and, most notably, Dr. Melanie Foster herself. The presence of the physician at the center of the controversy signaled that this would be more than a standard corporate response to crisis. The auditorium was packed with reporters from local and national news outlets, hospital staff, community leaders, and patient advocates who had been following the story since the viral video first appeared online. "Ladies and gentlemen," Crawford began, his voice carrying the gravity befitting the moment, "we are here today to announce comprehensive reforms designed to ensure that the discriminatory treatment experienced by Dr. Melanie Foster never happens again at this institution. But more importantly, we are here to announce that Dr. Foster has agreed to lead these efforts as our new Chief Equality Officer." The announcement sent a buzz through the auditorium as reporters scribbled notes and photographers captured the moment. Many had speculated that Dr. Foster might leave Mercy General entirely, either for another hospital or to pursue legal action against her current employer. Her decision to stay and take on this new role represented a surprising turn in a story that had captivated the medical community and beyond. Dr. Foster stepped forward to address the gathering, her demeanor calm and professional, despite the dozens of cameras focused on her. She had spent hours preparing her remarks, knowing that her words would be scrutinized by supporters and critics alike. 2 weeks ago, I was humiliated and discriminated against by an employee of this hospital who couldn't see past the color of my skin to recognize my qualifications and credentials, she began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. That incident was painful and demoralizing, but it also represented an opportunity to address systemic problems that extend far beyond one person's prejudiced actions. She paused, allowing her words to resonate with the audience before continuing. "I have spent 15 years as a cardiac surgeon, dedicating my life to healing hearts. Today, I accept a new challenge: healing the institutional heart of this hospital by ensuring that every employee, patient, and visitor is treated with dignity and respect." The symbolism of her medical metaphor was not lost on the audience, many of whom nodded in appreciation of her eloquent framing of the challenge ahead. Crawford then outlined the specific reforms that would be implemented under Dr. Foster's leadership. The comprehensive package included immediate termination of Robert Sterling and his supervisor Kevin Hayes, mandatory bias training for all employees, establishment of multiple reporting channels for discrimination complaints, regular external audits of hospital culture, and transparent annual reporting on diversity and inclusion metrics. "These are not cosmetic changes designed to improve our public image," Crawford emphasized. "These are fundamental shifts in how we operate as an institution, with real accountability measures and consequences for those who fail to meet our standards." The questions from reporters were pointed and probing, reflecting the skepticism that often greeted corporate promises of reform following discrimination scandals. "Dr. Foster," asked Jennifer Martinez from Channel 7 News, "you're giving up a prestigious surgical career to take on this administrative role. What guarantees do you have that the hospital will actually support meaningful change rather than just using your appointment as a public relations gesture?" Dr. Foster's response was direct and uncompromising. "I have negotiated complete authority to investigate discrimination complaints, implement necessary reforms, and hold all employees accountable regardless of their position. If the hospital fails to support these efforts, I will not hesitate to make that public and pursue other options." Another reporter pressed further. "What specific metrics will you use to measure success, and what timeline do you envision for seeing meaningful change?" "Within 6 months, we will have completed bias training for all employees and implemented new reporting systems." "Dr." Foster replied. "Within 1 year, I expect to see measurable improvements in employee satisfaction surveys, particularly among minority staff members. Within 2 years, we should see increased diversity in hiring and promotion, as well as improved patient satisfaction scores across all demographic groups." The specificity of her goals impressed many observers, suggesting that this was indeed more than symbolic gesture but a serious commitment to measurable reform. The National Medical Association, representing Black physicians, called her appointment a courageous step that could serve as a model for addressing discrimination throughout the healthcare system. Local civil rights groups praised the decision as evidence that Mercy General was willing to confront its failures publicly rather than bury them behind closed doors. Patients who had once considered transferring their care flooded social media with renewed pledges of loyalty, citing the hospital's willingness to empower one of its own. But reactions weren't universally positive. Some critics accused the hospital of tokenism, suggesting that appointing Dr. Foster to lead equality reforms was a convenient way to deflect attention from systemic problems. A few skeptical voices within the medical community questioned whether a single officer, even one as accomplished as Dr. Foster, could meaningfully shift entrenched institutional culture. Dr. Foster anticipated these critiques. "Change will not happen overnight," she told the reporters. "It will require accountability, persistence, and courage. I cannot promise perfection. What I can promise is that silence and complacency will no longer be acceptable here." The room erupted in applause, not from reporters, but from nurses, residents, and patients who had quietly slipped into the auditorium to show their support. For them, Dr. Foster wasn't just an administrator. She was living proof that dignity could triumph over prejudice. For days, Robert Sterling had remained hidden in his modest suburban home, blinds drawn tight against the throng of reporters that had camped outside. His once quiet cul-de-sac had been transformed into a media circus. Satellite trucks lined the curb, their dishes pointed skyward. Camera crews rotated shifts to ensure they didn't miss a single development. Neighbors, once friendly, now eyed his house with curiosity or disdain. To some, he was a victim of cancel culture. To most, he was the symbol of everything wrong with unchecked prejudice in institutions meant to heal. Sterling's world had shrunk overnight. A week earlier, he had been a man of routine. Each morning, he arrived at Mercy General's gift shop at 7:30 sharp, brewed a pot of stale coffee in the break room, and meticulously counted inventory. By evening, he returned home to microwave dinners and the company of his aging beagle, Duke. He wasn't wealthy, powerful, or particularly ambitious. His identity had been tied to that small shop, the flowers, the stuffed animals, the get-well cards, and the small sphere of authority he exercised there. Now, all of it was gone. The suspension letter had arrived 2 days after the incident. "Pending investigation into misconduct," it read, signed by the hospital's HR director. He'd lost his access badge, his paycheck, and the place where he had carved out his identity for nearly a decade. Worse than the professional blow was the humiliation. He had become a villain overnight, his name trending on Twitter alongside hashtags like #Dr. Denied and #Mercy General Shame. At first, Sterling clung to denial. He told himself the video circulating online had been edited to make him look bad. He told his sister over the phone that Dr. Foster had provoked him. He even convinced himself that Once the dust settled, the hospital board would quietly reinstate him. "I was protecting the hospital," he muttered to Duke as if rehearsing a defense. But deep down, he felt the shifting ground beneath his feet. The world outside his walls had decided who he was, and it wasn't flattering. On the fourth day, a local news crew managed to catch him as he left his house to pick up groceries. Cameras flashed, microphones thrust toward his face. His baseball cap did little to hide the anger etched across his features. "Mr. Sterling, do you have any comment on the allegations of racial discrimination?" shouted a reporter from Channel 9. Sterling snapped. "I was just doing my job. That's all I have to say." The clip went viral within hours. The internet dissected every frame, from the defensiveness in his tone to the dismissive wave of his hand. Online commentators noted the irony. A man accused of stereotyping others was now desperately pleading not to be stereotyped himself. Under pressure from family and his hastily retained lawyer, Sterling agreed to a sit-down interview with a local station. It was his chance, he believed, to set the record straight. The station promoted it heavily. Tonight at 8, Robert Sterling breaks his silence. When the interview aired, viewers saw a man in his late 50s, thinning gray hair slicked back, wearing an ill-fitting blazer. His posture was rigid, his hands clutched together on his lap, betraying nervous energy. The reporter's questions were measured but firm. "Mr. Sterling, why did you assume Dr. Foster wasn't a doctor?" Sterling hesitated, fumbling for words. "She didn't look like one. I mean, she wasn't in the formal uniform. Doctors usually wear ties or those long coats. She looked like she had just walked in off the street." The clip hit like a bombshell. Not only had he doubled down, but he had unwittingly admitted his bias on camera. Social media lit up with side-by-side photos of male surgeons in scrubs celebrated for their grit, contrasted against images of Dr. Foster in the same attire, dismissed by Sterling as an imposter. When pressed further about his words, "Real doctors don't look like you," Sterling shifted uncomfortably. "That was taken out of context," he insisted. "I was frustrated. People try to scam hospitals all the time. I thought she was another one of them. It wasn't about race, but the internet was unforgiving." Commentators replayed the moment he threw Dr. Foster's ID to the floor, dissecting it frame by frame. Civil rights leaders called it a textbook example of implicit bias turned explicit. Medical professionals across the country condemned his excuses. His claim that it was just about protecting the hospital rang hollow in the face of his recorded words. The backlash spilled far beyond the hospital walls. Local churches organized vigils in support of Dr. Foster. Community leaders demanded Sterling's permanent removal and the resignation of any supervisor who had enabled his behavior. Protesters gathered outside Mercy General, holding signs that read, "Doctors don't come in one color, and we trust Dr. Foster." Meanwhile, Sterling's house became a target. Graffiti appeared on his garage door. "Shame!" Teenagers shouted insults as they biked past. His mailbox overflowed with hate mail and, occasionally, letters of support from anonymous sympathizers who claimed he was being scapegoated. But those letters were few compared to the tidal wave of condemnation. Neighbors grew uneasy. One woman who had lived across the street for 15 years told a reporter, "He was always grumpy, but I never thought he was racist. Now I don't know what to think. I just want this to end." Sterling's isolation deepened. His sister stopped answering calls. His lawyer warned him against further public statements. Duke, loyal as ever, remained his only companion as he sat in silence, the glow of the television reflecting on his pale face. While Sterling tried to salvage his image, the hospital's internal investigation unearthed damning evidence. Interviews with volunteers, nurses, and even former gift shop clerks, revealed a consistent pattern of discriminatory behavior. He had regularly questioned the legitimacy of Black and Hispanic visitors. He had refused service to non-English speakers until they proved their connection to patients. He had even accused a janitor, an employee of 20 years, of snooping when he entered the shop during a break. Perhaps most telling was Sterling's attendance record. Out of 12 scheduled diversity training sessions since 2015, he had attended only one. His excuses ranged from scheduling conflicts to not relevant to retail staff. Supervisors had rubber-stamped these absences, viewing the trainings as optional inconveniences. Now, those ignored red flags stood as glaring evidence of institutional failure. When these findings became public, Sterling's credibility evaporated. His defenders, a small group who insisted he was being vilified for a misunderstanding, could no longer deny the larger pattern. The media shifted the narrative. This wasn't an isolated outburst, but the culmination of years of unchecked prejudice. Throughout Sterling's media blitz, Dr. Foster remained silent. She refused interview requests, declined to comment on Sterling's defenses, and focused instead on her patients and the reforms she was beginning to shape as Chief Equality Officer. Her silence spoke volumes. While Sterling scrambled to justify his actions, she embodied dignity and restraint. Colleagues noted that her decision not to engage was strategic. "She knows every word she says will be dissected," said Dr. Henderson, the chief of medicine. By refusing to spar with him publicly, she keeps the focus where it belongs, on systemic reform, not on a man desperate to save face. Her silence frustrated Sterling, who felt abandoned to the wolves. In private conversations with his lawyer, he complained bitterly. She could end this by admitting it was a misunderstanding. Instead, "She's letting me burn." But others saw it differently. She owed him nothing. The burden was his to bear. Sterling's downfall reached its climax when the hospital board released its official report. In a 40-page document, they laid out the investigation's findings in meticulous detail. His history of unprofessional conduct, his repeated avoidance of training, his consistent pattern of bias, and the failure of supervisors to intervene. The conclusion was blunt. Robert Sterling's actions constituted racial discrimination and violated the hospital's code of ethics. His employment was terminated effective immediately. The announcement sparked a fresh wave of headlines. Mercy General fires gift shop manager over racist incident. Board confirms pattern of discrimination. For Sterling, it was the final blow. He had lost his job, his reputation, and the small authority that had defined his life. The day after his termination, Sterling was spotted leaving his home with 2 cardboard boxes, escorted by his lawyer. Inside were the remnants of his career: old payroll stubs, a few commendation letters, and a faded photo of him behind the gift shop counter. The image went viral, a stark contrast to the proud, dismissive figure in the original video. Now he looked diminished, shuffling toward an uncertain future. In the weeks that followed, Sterling faded from the headlines. The media moved on to cover Mercy General's reforms and Dr. Foster's new role, but his story remained a cautionary tale, cited in discussions about workplace bias and institutional accountability. At seminars and conferences, trainers replayed the gift shop video as an example of how unchecked prejudice could spiral into national scandal. Sterling himself retreated into obscurity. He gave no further interviews, ignored calls from journalists, and lived quietly on his modest savings. Former colleagues described him as bitter, convinced he had been sacrificed to save the hospital's reputation. "He'll never admit he was wrong," one former clerk remarked. In his mind, he was the victim. Yet, outside his narrow worldview, the lesson was clear. Sterling's attempt to cling to authority through prejudice had not only cost him his career, but had also catalyzed sweeping reforms that would reshape Mercy General for years to come. His downfall, painful as it was, became the spark for progress. Sterling's story ended not with vindication but with silence, a silence that contrasted sharply with the voices rising around Dr. Foster. While he became a footnote in the larger narrative of discrimination, she was stepping into a role that promised transformation. The man who once believed he could decide who looked like a real doctor had been stripped of power, and the woman he tried to humiliate was now reshaping the institution he once represented. The irony was inescapable. His attempt to diminish her had instead elevated her. His refusal to see her humanity had forced the entire hospital and the wider medical community to confront its blind spots. Robert Sterling had spoken out, and in doing so, he had condemned himself more effectively than any critic ever could. The appointment of Dr. Melanie Foster as Chief Equality Officer was announced with fanfare, but the true test was never in the headlines. It was in the hallways, offices, and wards of Mercy General Hospital. Changing a culture was not a matter of a press release. It was a daily battle against inertia, skepticism, and habits ingrained over decades. If the Sterling incident had ripped open the wound, the work ahead would determine whether the institution would truly heal or simply scab over, leaving scars of resentment underneath. Dr. Foster began her new role with characteristic precision. On her first official morning as Chief Equality Officer, she arrived not in her surgical whites, but in a tailored navy suit, a deliberate signal that she was stepping into a new identity. Yet clipped to her jacket was her hospital badge, prominently displaying her title, Head of Cardiac Surgery divided by Chief Equality Officer. The dual designation mattered. She wanted staff to understand she hadn't abandoned medicine for politics. She was still a healer. But now she was tasked with healing more than hearts. Her first meeting was with Catherine Reynolds, the hospital's chief administrator, and Dr. Lisa Park, the diversity officer whose role had been advisory until now. Together, they pored over binders of data, patient satisfaction scores, employee surveys, HR complaints, and the thick file of reports on Robert Sterling. The numbers told a troubling story. Minority patients consistently rated their experiences lower than white patients, particularly in categories like respect from staff and clarity of communication. Complaints of bias were filed sporadically, but most never progressed beyond informal HR conversations. Staff surveys revealed that nearly 70% of employees did and not believe discrimination reports would be handled fairly. "This isn't about one gift shop manager," Dr. Foster said, closing one of the binders. "This is about a system that tells people it values diversity, but then shrugs when prejudice shows its face. That ends now." Her first major initiative was something she called Equity Rounds, modeled after medical case conferences. These monthly gatherings would be open forums where staff could share personal experiences of bias or inclusion, discuss how situations were handled, and propose solutions. The idea was radical in its transparency. Instead of whispering complaints in back rooms, the hospital would confront them out loud. The inaugural session took place in a modest lecture hall. The seats were packed, some with genuine interest, others with arms crossed, waiting to be unimpressed. Dr. Foster began not with a speech, but with a story. "I was in the gift shop, trying to buy flowers for my mother. You know what happened next. But here's what struck me the most. No one stopped it. People watched. Some recorded. But no one intervened. That's what culture does. It teaches us to stay silent, to wait for someone else to fix the problem. Equity rounds are about breaking that silence." The room fell still. Then, to her surprise, A nurse stood up. He described how a patient's family had once asked him to fetch the real nurse, meaning his white colleague, even though he had been leading the care team. Another staff member recounted being mistaken for housekeeping, despite being a radiology technician. Stories poured out, raw and unfiltered. By the end of the 2-hour session, the tension had given way to something else: recognition. For many, it was the first time they had spoken openly about the subtle cuts they endured daily. For others, it was the first time they had truly listened. But change did not come without resistance. Within weeks, Dr. Foster began hearing the whispers. Some physicians grumbled that the equity rounds were airing dirty laundry. A senior surgeon, off record, told a reporter, "We're here to save lives, not to hold sensitivity seminars." Others muttered that Dr. Foster was on a power trip, leveraging her victimhood into influence. The resistance was strongest among those who saw themselves as untouched by the Sterling scandal. "That was one man's mistake," said Kevin McMillan, a longtime anesthesiologist. "Why are we being punished for it?" Dr. Foster confronted such attitudes directly. In departmental meetings, she asked bluntly, "If Sterling was the only problem, why did so many of you tell me, after the fact, that you'd seen similar behavior for years? Why didn't anyone report it? Why did nurses warn each other to avoid the gift shop?" Her questions left rooms uncomfortably quiet. Change, she knew, was not just about policy but about psychology, breaking through denial and defensiveness to make people see the invisible structures that shape their everyday actions. Mandatory bias training had long been a box-checking exercise at Mercy General. Employees watched videos, signed attendance sheets, and went back to business unchanged. Dr. Foster was determined to transform it. She brought in outside experts from universities and civil rights organizations, designing sessions that were interactive, emotionally resonant, and tailored to healthcare. One module placed staff in simulated scenarios: a black resident giving orders during a code blue and being ignored until a white intern repeated them, a Latina nurse trying to advocate for a patient dismissed as non-compliant because of a language barrier. Participants were asked to role-play, then reflect on how bias had shaped their assumptions. At first, the discomfort was palpable. Some staff rolled their eyes, others muttered that it was political correctness gone mad. But gradually, as colleagues they respected shared vulnerable stories, the mood shifted. A veteran white nurse admitted she often second-guessed young black doctors, only realizing now that it wasn't about competence but unconscious bias. A security guard confessed he had shadowed black visitors more closely than white ones, thinking he was just being cautious. The sessions were painful, but they broke open conversations that had long been buried. Dr. Foster knew good intentions weren't enough. In medicine, we measure outcomes. Why should equality be different? She argued. Under her leadership, the hospital implemented a battery of metrics, tracking patient satisfaction by race, ethnicity, and language preference, monitoring staff promotions and raises to ensure equity, Extos, recording every discrimination complaint, and publishing quarterly summaries for transparency. Within 6 months, early signs of progress appeared. Reports of bias initially surged, a sign experts noted that employees finally trusted the system enough to speak up. By the next quarter, resolution rates improved, with disciplinary action taken in 40% of cases. Patient satisfaction among minority families ticked upward, citing respect from staff as a notable improvement. These numbers became a shield against skeptics. When critics accused Dr. Foster of chasing headlines, she pointed to the data. "We are not chasing optics. We are saving trust. And trust saves lives." Yet behind her calm public demeanor, The work took a toll. Dr. Foster's schedule became relentless. Surgeries in the mornings, equality work through afternoons and evenings. Her office filled with stacks of reports, while her voicemail overflowed with calls from other hospitals asking how to replicate Mercy General's reforms. She rarely slept more than 5 hours. Friends worried about her. "You're carrying this hospital on your back," Aaliyah Washington warned one evening as they grabbed coffee. "Don't lose yourself in it." But Dr. Foster felt the weight of history. Every young woman of color who wrote her letters of thanks, every patient who said they now felt safer walking into Mercy General, reminded her why she couldn't slow down. "This is bigger than me," she told Aaliyah. "If I don't push now, the momentum will fade." Change revealed itself in small, almost invisible ways that, to Dr. Foster, meant everything. In the cafeteria, she overheard a white surgeon correct a colleague who dismissed a black nurse's suggestion. "No, listen to her. She's right." In a board meeting, donors who once questioned diversity spending now praised it as vital to the hospital's future. Patients of color reported fewer incidents of being mistaken for visitors or janitorial staff. Isaiah Thompson, the security guard who had once been caught in Sterling's crossfire, approached her one day. "Dr. Foster, I wanted you to know. We had an incident last night. A visitor complained about being profiled. This time, I spoke up. I backed my colleague when he said it wasn't right. I wouldn't have done that a year ago." Those moments were the true markers of transformation, when people who once stayed silent chose to act. As Mercy General's reforms gained traction, national media returned, this time with a different angle, from shame to model. How Mercy General transformed after viral scandal, read a feature in the New York Times. Medical journals invited Dr. Foster to publish her approach. The American Heart Association honored her with a leadership award, not just for her surgical innovations, but for her institutional reform. Other hospitals called, asking her to consult. Some wanted to hire her outright, but she refused to leave. "Mercy General is my home," she told them. "If we can change here, we can prove it's possible anywhere." Not everyone welcomed the new culture. A small but vocal group of staff continued to resist, complaining anonymously to local papers about diversity witch hunts. Some donors quietly withdrew support, uncomfortable with the hospital's outspoken stance. Online forums filled with conspiracy theories that Dr. Foster was politicizing medicine, but she refused to bend. "Medicine has always been political," she countered in a lecture. "Who gets care? Who gets believed? Who gets funded? These are all political choices. Pretending otherwise is part of the problem." Her bluntness earned her both admirers and detractors. Yet it also cemented her reputation as a leader who would not dilute the truth for comfort. By the end of the first year, Mercy General looked and felt different. The once muted whispers of discrimination had given way to open dialogue. Staff who once avoided reporting incidents now had multiple channels to seek justice. Patients felt safer, staff felt heard, and the institution's reputation, once tarnished, was slowly being rebuilt. In a speech to the board, Dr. Foster summed it up. "We cannot undo the past, but we can ensure it shapes us into something better." The Sterling incident was not the end of our story. It was the beginning of our transformation. For Mercy General, the journey was far from complete. But the cultural heart of the hospital was beating differently now, stronger, steadier, and guided by the conviction that healing meant more than surgery and medicine. It meant justice, dignity, and inclusion. And at its center stood the woman who had turned humiliation into a catalyst for change. The Sterling incident had begun as a personal humiliation, a single jarring moment in a hospital gift shop where a surgeon was mistaken for an imposter. But by the time the first anniversary arrived, it had transformed into something much larger, a case study in how institutions fail, how they can choose to repair themselves, and how individuals like Dr. Melanie Foster can become unwilling symbols of change. What had once been whispered about in hospital corridors was now discussed on national stages, in classrooms, in policy meetings, and in living rooms across the country. On the anniversary of the viral video, Mercy General Hospital held a press conference not to defend itself, but to celebrate measurable progress. The stage was flanked by banners declaring Mercy Renewal Initiative, 1 year strong. Cameras rolled as David Crawford, the board chairman, spoke with the tone of a man chastened but determined. "Last year," he began, "this institution failed one of its most distinguished physicians, and in doing so, it failed its mission. Today, we stand not to erase that failure, but to acknowledge how it propelled us toward necessary change." Thanks to Dr. Foster's leadership, Mercy General is no longer the same hospital it was 12 months ago. The numbers spoke for themselves. Complaints of discrimination were now resolved within an average of 27 days, compared to over 90 before. Patient satisfaction scores among minority families had climbed by nearly 20%. Staff turnover among nurses of color had dropped sharply, a sign that employees who once felt alienated now believed they belonged. For the first time in its history, the hospital had released a full diversity report, detailing not just demographic data but outcomes by race and ethnicity, a level of transparency that shocked even seasoned healthcare administrators. Dr. Foster took the podium next. "This hospital cannot undo its past mistakes," she said, her voice calm and steady. "But what we can do is ensure those mistakes become catalysts for reform, not monuments to shame. We are building a new culture here, one where dignity is not negotiable and where healing means more than medicine." Applause filled the room, but it was more than polite clapping. Many in the audience, patients, nurses, doctors, community leaders, rose to their feet. It was a standing ovation not just for her, but for what her presence represented. Mercy General's story became a case study in medical schools, MBA programs, and civil rights seminars. Harvard Business Review published an article titled, "When Bias Becomes Policy: Lessons from Mercy General." Johns Hopkins invited Dr. EPA Bryce with over SS Foster to deliver a keynote at its Medical Ethics Symposium, where she spoke candidly. "I did not choose to be humiliated that day, but I chose how to respond. And in choosing reform over revenge, I discovered that healing institutions is as necessary as healing patients." Honoring her dual contributions as a surgeon and as a reformer. Civil rights groups praised her for refusing to let the hospital sweep the scandal under the rug. Even skeptical commentators who had initially dismissed her appointment as a PR stunt admitted that the outcomes proved otherwise. The broader healthcare community began reaching out. Hospitals from Chicago to Dallas invited her to consult. Nonprofits asked her to join advisory boards. State legislatures requested her testimony on bills addressing healthcare discrimination. Dr. Foster accepted some opportunities, declined others, but always emphasized that her priority remained Mercy General. "This is my home," she told a reporter from The Atlantic. "If we can build real equity here, in a century-old institution with deep traditions and inertia, then others will have no excuse." For all the accolades, it was the voices of patients that carried the greatest weight. Mercy General's waiting rooms became filled with stories, cards, and letters expressing gratitude. Some were from patients who had been treated by Dr. Foster directly. Others came from families who had never met her but felt safer. knowing someone like her was shaping the hospital's future. One letter, read aloud at an equity round session, came from the daughter of a cardiac patient. When my father was admitted, I feared he would be dismissed or ignored because of his accent. Instead, every staff member treated him with respect. That dignity saved not just his heart, but our family's faith in this hospital. Foster, you may not have been in the operating room with us, but your presence was felt in every interaction. Another came from a young black medical student shadowing at Mercy General. I used to walk into hospitals bracing myself for the moment someone questioned if I belonged. At Mercy, I still feel the challenges, but I also feel something else. Possibility. Seeing you lead makes me believe I can stand in your shoes one day. For Dr. Foster, these testimonies were both affirmations and reminders of the weight she carried. Each story reinforced that her role extended beyond policy and into the realm of lived experience. She was not just changing rules, she was altering how people felt when they crossed the threshold of Mercy General, yet the cost of leadership was steep. Dr. Foster's calendar became a battlefield. Between surgeries, board meetings, media appearances, and national conferences, her days often stretched past midnight. Friends noticed the toll. Dark circles under her eyes, fewer social outings, the rare but telling sighs of exhaustion. Aaliyah Washington, her closest confidant, confronted her one evening after a long shift. "Melanie, you're burning the candle at both ends. You can't save the hospital if you collapse in the process." Dr. Foster smiled, weary but resolute. "I know, but every time I think about slowing down, I remember what it felt like to have my badge thrown on the floor. I remember the silence of the people watching. I can't let that silence win." Her mother, too, expressed concern. "Baby, you fought so hard to be a surgeon. Don't lose that part of yourself." Dr. Foster reassured her, pointing to the one day each week she still spent in the operating room. "That's my anchor," she explained. "No matter what else I do, I'll never stop healing with my hands." Even as progress mounted, criticism lingered. Some accused her of politicizing healthcare. Anonymous editorials in local papers claimed the hospital was more focused on diversity metrics than patient outcomes. A handful of donors permanently withdrew support, unwilling to associate their names with what they dismissed as social engineering. On social media, detractors mocked the equity rounds as therapy circles and questioned whether Dr. Foster's reforms truly mattered in life-or-death situations. Dr. Foster confronted such skepticism head-on. In one widely shared speech, she declared, "Bias is not a side issue. When a nurse's warnings are ignored because of who she is, patients die. When a doctor's authority is questioned because of how she looks, care is delayed. When families feel mistrusted, they withhold information critical to treatment." Equity is not a distraction from medicine, it is medicine. Her words cut through the noise, reframing the debate not as politics versus healthcare, but as healthcare done right versus healthcare compromised by prejudice. By the second year, Mercy General had become a model others sought to replicate. Hospitals in California and New York adopted versions of the equity rounds. Medical schools incorporated her story into ethics curricula. Even corporate HR departments outside healthcare studied the case. Seeing parallels in how discrimination undermines trust in any institution, the New England Journal of Medicine published a landmark article co-authored by Dr. Foster. "From Gift Shop to Operating Room, Addressing Bias Across the Continuum of Care." It outlined not just Mercy General's reforms, but practical steps any hospital could adopt. The article concluded, "Bias unchecked is not just a moral failing but a clinical risk. Addressing it is not ancillary to patient care. It is central to it. Her work began influencing policy at state and federal levels. Health departments adopted new guidelines for reporting discrimination in hospitals. Accrediting bodies added diversity compliance to their inspection checklists. What began as one woman's humiliation was now reshaping the infrastructure of American medicine. Within the hospital itself, the cultural shift was visible. New employees received orientation not just on safety protocols but on equity standards. Annual reviews now included assessments of inclusivity. Promotions considered not only technical skill but contributions to team culture. In the cardiac surgery department, younger residents of color reported feeling more confident speaking up during rounds. "I know my voice matters now," said Dr. Nina Patel, a third-year resident. And that's because Dr. Foster showed us that silence can be deadly. Even skeptics softened. The anesthesiologist who had once dismissed reforms as punishment later admitted at an equity round, "I didn't see it before, but I've realized how many times I assumed things about colleagues or patients that weren't fair. I can't promise I'll never slip, but I can promise I'll keep learning." For Dr. Foster, those small confessions were proof that culture had shifted not by decree but by dialogue. As Mercy General basked in national recognition, Dr. Foster wrestled with her own identity. To the world, she had become a symbol. The doctor who endured humiliation and turned it into reform. But privately, she remained a woman balancing exhaustion, personal sacrifice, and the quiet longing for normalcy. One evening, sitting alone in her office surrounded by flowers from grateful patients, she reflected in her journal, "I never wanted to be a symbol. I just wanted to heal hearts." But maybe this is what healing hearts looks like now, not only repairing what's inside bodies, but repairing what's inside institutions. Perhaps this is the surgery I was always meant to perform. Her words captured the paradox. She had gained influence. She never sought, but wielded it with the same precision she once reserved for scalpels and sutures. By the time the second anniversary arrived, the Sterling incident was no longer remembered primarily for his actions, but for hers. Robert Sterling had faded into obscurity, a cautionary tale. Dr. Foster had risen, not because she wanted to, but because history demanded it. At a national conference on healthcare equity, she closed her keynote with words that would echo beyond the room. "We talk about legacy as if it is something we leave behind. But legacy is something we build in every moment, in every choice to speak up instead of stay silent, to heal instead of harm, to include instead of exclude. The Sterling incident did not define me. What defines me, and what can define all of us, is what we choose to do after the wound is revealed." The audience rose in thunderous applause, but Dr. Foster's gaze remained steady, not basking in glory but looking toward the work still ahead. She knew the fight against bias in medicine was far from over, but she also knew that Mercy General's story had proven something powerful. Institutions can change when individuals demand it, when silence is broken, and when dignity becomes non-negotiable. Her legacy was already in motion, not just in policies and reports, but in the hearts of patients who now walked into Mercy General believing they would be seen, heard, and healed. And perhaps that was the most profound surgery of all.